The guy that called me and said and used God's name in vain about 5 times, ordering a duck call. And I was thinking, man, I said, look, why do you keep cursing the only one that can save you from death? Well, there was just silence. About the 5th time, he said, GD, something. I thought, why do you keep cursing him? Well, there was silence on the phone. He said, hey, you got my order? I said, I got your order. So he hangs up. 10 minutes goes by. The phone rings again. He said, hey. I said, yeah. He said, it's me again. He said, I've never thought about that. I said, well, you curse God like he's done something to you. I said, man, I said, he can save you, give you eternal life. I said, you know what you ought to do? And I looked down at his sheet right quick. I said, you ought to drive over here. I said, it's about, from where you are, about 8, 9 hours. I said, you ought to drive over here, and I'll tell you a story about the one you're cursing. I said, you may change your mind. He said, well, I might do that, Hoss. I said, you ought to. Boom. A week goes by, and the knock on the door, and the dude steps in. He said, you know who I am? I said, he's a husky. I said, no, I don't believe I ever met you. He said, I'm the one that was cursing God. I said, so you did come? He said, I got to know. I said, come on in here. Look, he was converted. 17 years went by. I'm speaking over there in the state he was from. And the preacher says, somebody walked up there and he said, Phil, you remember the dude that was cursing God on the phone? I said, cursing God on the phone? I said, I remember that way back. I said, that's been a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago. He said, he's down there waiting on you, wanting to talk to you. He heard you was coming to this church tonight. He said, by the way, he's one of the leaders of this church now. Mm-hmm. I said, my point is, just like you and that girl, you never know.
A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. He who seeks good finds goodwill, but evil comes to him who searches for it. Proverbs 11:27. Be generous. Don't forget that.
I've tied so many ropes on so many bushes. 5 miles worth of nets. I had to remember where every one of them was tied. Every once in a while I'd miss one. The water would go down, I'd see my rope. I'm like, I forgot I put a net in there 3 months ago. No one else knew where it was. So I see that rope. I said, them rednecks can see that rope too. A lot of rednecks, they see a rope going down in the water, they're like, whoa. We may have some catch a fish here. So there were always thieves. When I started giving them the fish they were trying to steal, they quit stealing from me. I'd catch them stealing. I'd say, y'all, pull your boat over here. I'd surprise them at gunpoint.